Okay, thank you, Dr. Alfonso. Now, as a lawyer, I begin with a definition. It's difficult in this case. There are a range of views as to what might constitute corporal punishment. I think common to most of the opinions that I've seen is that it involves the use of violence, and violence there is used in a wide sense. So it is a spectrum of violence, which ranges from the lightest tap, this is what the cases say, to the infliction of more serious wounds. Now, if you're discussing corporal punishment in the context of children, then I think the presumptive position must be that you are looking at a form of abuse. And that's because, in my view, violence is not something that one should contemplate as a possibility in terms of discipline for any human being, especially those in our part of the world, given our lived experience, but more so in the context of children, who are perhaps the most vulnerable. Now, in this jurisdiction, you have two sources of law, one primary and the other secondary. Now, the primary source would be the Children's Act, and I've pulled out the section in the Children's Act. It's section 22, subsection 1. And that section, I think, is permissive, so it runs against what I've just said. It says, nothing in this part shall be construed to take away or affect the right of any parent, teacher, or other person having the lawful control or charge of a child or young person to administer reasonable punishment to such child or young person. So the focus in the law, which is the primary source in this jurisdiction, the focus is on the parent, the teacher, and then there's as legislation sometimes would provide for a generic class or other person having lawful control of the child. And the section in this jurisdiction allows the use of reasonable force as a means of punishing the behavior of children. So the legislative framework is permissive, but I said there are two potential sources. Trinidad is a party, a signatory to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and of course the convention is unambiguous. It says that this type of punishment is not to be countenanced. Now, there are other pieces of legislation, the Summary Offences Act and so on, and I've seen those provisions are generic, and they don't speak to the infliction of violence on children. They treat with outlawing common assaults and assaults in general. Of course, my view is that those provisions do apply to children. Now, from a legal point of view, you're going to have a difficulty with construing the Children's Act, which seems to permit corporal punishment, and then the general law, which obviously would, in my view, not sanction it. Now, I think that a court properly seized of jurisdiction in this area would defer, but was subordinate the provision, the allowances given by the Children's Act, because the section, and this is it's a narrow reading of the section. The section says nothing in this part. It doesn't seek to trump the general law. It says nothing in this part shall. So there's no direct authority on this point, but in my view, the general provisions ought to, given our treaty commitments, I think that the general provisions ought to be, can be used creatively by judges to trump the very modest protection which is offered by the Children's Act. Now that's on one side. In Canada, from where we get a lot of our commercial legislation, it seems as if, and the UK as well, in Canada, it seems as if corporal punishment is now countenanced, so that there's a decision of the Supreme Court in Canadian Foundation for Children versus Canada, a decision given by the Chief Justice in which she seems to say, yes, it's permissible, but in terms of how you inflict it, you do not inflict on children under the age of 2, and you do not inflict on teenagers. And of course, well, she puts further strictures in place. She says minor corrective force is what is contemplated, not abuse. But I mean, it's a slippery slope, and there is, as the literature seems to suggest, a spectrum within which certain types of behavior can bleed into, even if they begin as some, to use the language of the court in the Canadian case, some sort of minor corrective form of punishment that would bleed into, escalate into something else. So that, where do we go in terms of reform in, I mean, the law is not settled in Trinidad. It's not in a proper state of development. You have our international obligations on the one hand, which say, do not use corporal punishment. And then you have the Children's Act, which says, yes, you can use it. And the general law, which in my view says, no, you don't. You don't, because it's the slightest form of touching is potentially an assault. So there is a need for reform. Which direction we ought to go? Of course, I pitch in on this issue in favor of the view that given our historical circumstances, we ought to set a pretty high standard on human integrity and protecting the dignity of human life. And that means the complete human, it means the child, and it means respecting the integrity of the child's personality and not subjecting the child to any form of corporal punishment. So that, I think that the Children's Act is in some need of reform, and that reform ought to go in that direction. Thank you, Dr. Afonso.
Thank you, Mr. Jeremie. I think that may explain why people are confused as to what exactly they can legally do, because even the law seems to be a little bit confused. I want to move us right along into Dr. Mendez's presentation. Melissa, she's asked me to call on Melissa this afternoon. Melissa, I know she has a PowerPoint presentation, so the floor is yours. Yes, we can see the presentation, Melissa.
Right. So you can see the presentation now. Brill, thank you. Thanks, Timothy. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this panel. When I was asked to do this presentation on corporal punishment, because it isn't specifically my little niche area of expertise, I did what any researcher with assault would do, and went into the articles and tried to do some research on to see what I could find. So I'll start telling you a little bit about what I found in terms of corporal punishment. And we're taking it from more of a sociological point of view than a legal one. So we'll start with the international research on corporal punishment. And we're going to go through these slides fairly quickly because I don't want to overrun my time. But please let me know if you would like to have a copy of the presentation later on, because I'm happy to email it to you. So I started with a study by Strauss and others in the US that found what's the general consensus really in sociological academia. Corporal punishment may create or exacerbate deviance. You know, so like many other sociological academic work, Strauss's work says that there might be a link between corporal punishment and later deviance in later life. But like a lot of other research, it suggests that this link could be quite a weak one, because we cannot prove causation, that one causes the other. Next, we have Durand, who was looking at the well-being of young people in Sweden. And what he found there was that after the Swedish corporal punishment, there was a ban of corporal punishment in Sweden in 1979, I think it was. And after that ban, what was found was that rates of youth involvement in crime, rates of youth involvement in alcohol, drug use, rape, and suicide considerably decreased after there was a ban on corporal punishment. Lenter, so that was in Sweden. Lenter in Australia, through their research, found that corporal punishment poses a risk of psychological harm to children, violates children's rights, as Mr. Jeremie was saying a little bit earlier. Then we have Jennifer Lansford, whose research I find really, really interesting, because she examined culture as a filter that can either erase or exacerbate the effects of corporal punishment on a child's behavior. So how do people from different cultures use corporal punishment, and how does that affect their children then? So what Lansford found was that culture was really, really important, and that if corporal punishment is the norm within a given culture, then children might believe that their parents are using corporal punishment or beating them licks as part of a planned strategy that is in their best interest. And this could serve as a buffer against adverse effects of corporal punishment. And I found that really interesting. But even with that finding, Lansford in an earlier paper, and does not retract this, says that societal rates of corporal punishment of children can predict societal levels of violence. So what they found in that research there, Lansford and, what is it on the slide? Lansford and Dodge, they found that where you have more corporal punishment, you usually find a more violent society. So that was some of the international sort of research that I looked at, but we know Lansford is talking about, culture and context is so very, very important. So I want to move to the regional and the local, yeah? What happens in the Caribbean context? So Payne, doing research in Barbados quite a while ago, back in 1989, found that majority of citizens approved of corporal punishment in child rearing, yeah? Very similar to, not at all dissimilar from other Caribbean countries or the Caribbean nations. Landon and others in 2017 undertook what was quite a very thorough literature review. So just a review of loads of literature. They did I forget what it's called now, but a really in-depth literature review, including Caribbean studies as well as international studies. And based on that academic literature, based on the empirical evidence that they found, they concluded that corporal punishment is family violence, and it's actually a precursor to social violence in the Caribbean. So quite similar to what was found in some of the international research. And the last one on this slide, research by Smith and Mosby, they thought that harsh disciplinary practices really exact a heavy toll on children. It can evoke really negative reactions into adolescence, and that can have really far-reaching social implications. So they made some really important recommendations for changing the discourse around and the practice of corporal punishment in the Caribbean. And their recommendations included education and counseling, home visitation, but really, really importantly, included research. So I'd like to say just a little bit about some research that I did at the YTC a few years ago. So my research at YTC wasn't specifically about corporal punishment. It was about pathways into and out of crime. So I was interested in exploring the reasons given by young offenders for their involvement in crime, what they hoped their lives would be after they left the YTC, whether they wanted to continue being in crime, and some of them did, or whether they wanted to change their lives and what they thought that might look like. But in eliciting their stories, corporal punishment was one of the things that we talked about. And what I found was that almost all of the boys that I interviewed had experienced corporal punishment from a parent or a guardian before entering the YTC. And some of them had experienced really severe abuse rather than anything that could be labeled discipline. And I have just a couple of examples here. I can't really go into too much, but I do have a couple of examples. So Vishnu says, I never used to like my father. My father used to rail drink and come home and beat my mother, slam me in the ground and thing. But I was small them time, and so none of we couldn't do nothing. Everybody knew my father was a madman. He used to want to fight with everybody, cuss up everybody and thing. So nobody never really used to help. My mother used to leave he plenty. My mother used to run away and leave we home with he for 2 to 3 months straight. He frustrated, he crying, he begging. Whenever he see she, he begging she to come back. Whenever she come back, it's the same thing again, licks. So it wasn't an abnormal story. Here we have Anil talking about an incident with an older brother now, not a parent. And he said, when the brother come home drunk, he used to beat we, push we. One time he was burning grass in the yard, leaf and thing. And I was looking to rake up the bush into the fire, and he just come from behind me and pushed me in the fire. My whole back was in the fire. I thought my back was on fire, but only my hand burned. Me and get burned bad. I went to the hospital. And these are just, because I only have a very short period of time, these are just two of many stories. So this is my last slide, Timothy. Research suggests, mine and others, that boys who come from violent homes or violent communities, they learn 2 main things through this violence. The first is that violence is an appropriate way to resolve conflicts, and that individuals within their environment have hostile intentions towards them. And this can result in a skewed sense of people's intentions towards these young people. They may inappropriately attribute hostile intent where none exists, and they may see the world as a hostile place. And one of the real challenges that we're seeing, that I saw through my research, but as we see more colloquially, is that stressed parents in these settings, they tend to use physical and coercive forms of punishment, desperately trying to keep their children off of the streets, out of gangs, out of harm's way, yeah? But despite these good intentions of these parents, it's often within the home that these young people first learn about violent behavior, and this can then translate to behavior outside of the home. So I'm wrapping up now, but I do want to be clear, and I suppose I'm ending where I began. So I'm not saying that there is a clear causal link between corporal punishment and future criminal behavior. But the evidence internationally, regionally, and locally does suggest that corporal punishment, particularly more stringent beatings, is we're culturally used to in some places in the Caribbean. This can normalize violent behavior and have adverse consequences for young people later on in life. Thank you.
Melissa, thank you very much. I really wish we could have heard more, but we want to hear the participants. We want to hear the audience and what they want to, how they engage with you. I thought it was very interesting, that Lansford research on how if children see the corporal punishment as being something that could be beneficial, then the negative effects may not be what we think. But I mean, there is definitely this link that you're establishing, that Mr. Jeremie established, and that is the link between violence and the phenomenon of corporal punishment. Thank you very much. I would like to move to Nadiya Gower de Chabert for her presentation.
Good afternoon. So as an attorney, I also kind of looked at the legislative framework a bit. So in relation to the Children Act of 2012, it is unlawful for corporal punishment to be issued in educational institutions. However, even up until recently, we saw an article in the newspaper where this young boy was slapped 3 times by a music teacher, and his mother filed a case against the state in relation to that action. And even though the state has not pursued it and it's a question of damages for the young boy, the Honorable Justice Frank C. Prasad indicated, or he had to remind the public that corporal punishment is something that is unlawful. Now, in 2015, I just want to get into a little bit about the history of the child protection legislation. There were three main pieces of legislation that were brought into force in 2015. That would have been the Children's Authority Act. And this was operating as the hub of the new national child protection system and performing key functions geared towards safeguarding and improving the lives of children in Trinidad and Tobago. And primarily what the Children's Authority was charged with was receiving and investigating reports of mistreatment, establishing a 24-hour helpline, establishing an emergency response unit for investigating those reports, and this would operate on a 24-hour basis. Then we have the Children's Act, and this modernized the approach to child protection and qualified a child as someone under the age of 18 and had a wider and more comprehensive range of criminal offenses for the protection of children, and also the framework for a more collaborative relationship between the authority, the police, and the court in the detection of management of child abuse cases. And then, of course, we have the Children's Community Residences, Foster Care and Nurseries Act of 2000. I'm going to get into that in a little bit towards the end of the presentation, because that is quite topical now, having regard to the recent report from retired Court of Appeal Judge Justice Shooter Jones. So the government has also been working in tandem in trying to ensure the protection of children and also ensure that we are in line with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we have the Family and Children Division Bill, and we have the establishment of the Children Court in Port of Spain and in Faizabad in February of 2018 to hear all children matters, right? And we also have a Child Advocacy Unit, which is operating out of the Solicitor General's Department and the Child Protection Unit in the Police Service. Now, even though we have indicated that, or we have signed off or ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, despite the UN's repeated recommendations in terms of abolishing corporal punishment in its entirety, there were still reports, which I wasn't surprised to hear in Melissa's reports in terms of the quote from Payne, that the majority of citizens approve of corporal punishment in child rearing, because in an addendum to the reports on the review of our local legislation coming out of 2016. This was a quote that was taken from the report. In relation to the issue of corporal punishment, it has traditionally been accepted as a legitimate form of discipline for youngsters in the Caribbean and mainly inherited as a result of traditional lifestyles from the vast diaspora, which constitutes the social and historical composition of most Caribbean countries. So that is taken from a UN report in terms of our stance on corporal punishment in the home. Now, in February 2020, there was an article in the Express which stated that parents can still beat their children. And the Children's Authority was urging parents to find alternative means of disciplining their children. So this came at the heels of the death of 8-year-old Mikisha Maynard after an alleged beating from her father, right? And the article goes on to quote the authority as stating that it recognized that some parents and guardians are under extreme stress, they have little support, and they may resort to corporal punishment when disciplining their children, especially when overwhelmed. Now, this was particularly interesting to me that this article was written in February 2020, because what happens a month later, we're thrown into the pandemic. And I have observed, at least anecdotally, that parents, this situation of parents being stressed and not knowing how to handle their children or how to discipline their children has been severely exacerbated. And if you're in a situation where you cannot, or you don't have another forum or another way to figure out how to properly discipline your children or safely discipline your children, then you resort to corporal punishment. And just within this last month, we have, well, Timothy mentioned the death of Aaliyah, 15-year-old, who was allegedly beaten by her father with a belt, and she died. And then over the last month, there was 3 drownings of very young children. So it is a very saddening state that we are in. And the recommendations are simply from the UN, and also for a previous local task force that we had, is to do away with corporal punishment entirely. And we have to take away this concept of reasonable punishment, because it is subjective and there's no way of policing what you consider to be reasonable punishment for children. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the question of children's homes. Even though it's a bit topical now, we've seen in the papers over the last week in terms of the report from retired Court of Appeal Judge Justice Judith Jones, right? So the Children's Act was amended sometime in 2018, and it says that corporal punishment shall not be used in any child in relation to a child in a nursery, children's home or foster home, a resident in a rehabilitation center, or a child in the custody, care, and control of a fit person. And that same 2018 legislation amended the Children's Community Residences Foster Care Nurseries Act, and it said that a child placed in a children's home shall not be subjected to corporal punishment, restraint or force as a form of punishment, the reduction or change of diets as a form of punishment, or the restriction or denial of contact with family as a form of punishment. So this report came about because the task force was implemented in mid-July of 2021, and what we observed was an increase in reports over the last 3 years, and they wanted to find out why children were basically absconding from these homes. So there would have been a report sometime in last year in March of 2021 where 2 boys were killed after they were running away from one of these rehabilitation centers, right? The report, in summary, because we have limited time, was horrific in terms of the abuse that was meted out to these children in their home, in these rehabilitation homes, as a form of discipline. And what also came out of it is that, so you have the staff to resident abuse, and that also cultivates a culture of violence in these homes. And the staff is unable to they cannot control the children, and they need to use the security to do that. And the security is completely untrained to handle these children who are now violent, and they're promoting this culture of violence. So I just wanted to quickly wrap up and say that the recommendations of the report, they are essentially, there's a need to align the functions of those child support centers with their statutory mandates. And also there's a requirement to inspect and determine when children's homes should retain their license and who should be given a new license. And they need to establish clear and reliable systems for children to register their in-house complaints. Now there is a commissioner, a children's commissioner, and they are talking about having more accountability and transparency in that regard, and the separation of high-risk children from moderate and low-risk ones. And I just wanted to mention an amendment to the Domestic Violence Act of 2020 in terms of expanding who can apply for a protection order. And this now includes a child who's under the age of 18 who resides at a children's home where the respondent is a manager or employee engaged in an employment of a children's home. So that's.
Nadiya, thank you very much. I think this culture of violence is something that really stays with me from your presentation. And this idea of the impact of COVID on families, I think it really does demonstrate that there is a problem in how parents have to deal with the reality of the stress of child rearing. And maybe it could just be that there is a lack of alternative information on how else discipline can take place. So thank you for that. We now move to the presentation by Sonji Harris Guppy, a trained psychologist. Sonji?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Timothy. Thank you to everyone listening, the participants, and also good afternoon to the panel. As a psychologist, I suppose my view is a bit different from everyone else's. I would take it from the vantage point or the approach of actually being a trainer in terms of different parenting programs, and also as a clinician in terms of what I observe is in the population that I do see. But I did want to start with, because this is what I like to do, I did want to start with a quote taken from Judith Lewis Herman, who wrote Trauma and Recovery, the Aftermath of Violence, From Domestic Abuse to Political Terror, a very influential book as well, if anyone would like to read it. But what she does see is that many abused children cling to the hope that growing up will bring escape and freedom. But the personality formed in the environment of coercive control is not well adapted to adult life. The survivor is left with fundamental problems in basic trust, autonomy, and initiative. She approaches the task of early adulthood, establishing independence and intimacy, burdened by major impairments in self-care, in cognition, and in memory, in identity, and in the capacity to form stable relationships. She is still a prisoner of her childhood, attempting to create a new life. She re-encounters the trauma. And in reading this book, I mean, it speaks to so many situations that I have also dealt with in terms of children who have been victims of child abuse or been subject to corporal punishment. And I will take it from the approach to start with. Early on in my career, I was given the wonderful challenge of conducting a workshop or parenting program in St. Lucia in a very small community. And that would have been in 2010. And one of the sessions in the actual program itself, they asked the children of the parents to come in and actually tell their parents how they felt about being beaten, how they felt about their actual discipline practices. And of course, many of the children did not want to share how licks made them feel or what their parents did made them feel. But one young man, he was about 13, he actually spoke up and he said to his guardian, he said, "When you beat me, it hurts. I feel unloved and I don't think that you like me and I wish that I could disappear." And in hearing this and feeling so proud that he was so brave to share this with his guardian, I looked at the guardian and she had tears in her eyes. And in discussing what her charge had said, she said she never understood that beating him would have had this level of emotional impact. She was coming from the standpoint that she was raising a young man in an impoverished community and she needed to keep him on the right track. So she needed to do all that was the best for him. So she was coming from a loving perspective. But what I saw was a child who was withdrawn, had very poor attachments or inappropriate attachments. And very often when he would say things that he felt sad about and he would cry, he would still smile at the same time. And that was very telling in terms of how he's internalizing the beatings, the punishment, the discipline that he was getting. And to even move even further, research is telling us that the impact of corporal punishment or physical abuse is leading children, adolescents down a road towards anxiety, depression, alcoholism, and also poor attachments in terms of later on their relationships with others. And we're also seeing children as well viewing violence as a way of solving problems. So if you need to get rid of something, if you need to treat with something, if you need to manage a conflict, one of the things that is going to be appropriate and is seen is going to be dealing with it through violence, because essentially that's how violence is used in the home. And another aspect as well, in terms of even going through the research and even talking to parents, many parents will tell you, well, I got licks and I'm okay. Or you hear adults, I got licks and I'm all right. I turned out okay. And one of the things, I bring back into the conversation would be, okay, you were okay. And you're probably lucky that you are okay. But what about the unlucky ones? What about those who are now dealing with stress disorders, dealing with anxiety, depression, can't manage their conflict, can't manage their emotions, have little to no emotional intelligence? If you're okay, that's wonderful because you are able to function. But there are others who are not able to function and in some instances have not survived. So we do also need to understand that there's a clear difference, just based on definition, between discipline and punishment. Punishment is based on control and punishment is based on compliance and aggressive behaviors. Discipline is looking at how do I allow my child to understand right and wrong and cause and effect. How do I allow my children to understand the morals and values of our family? And how do I allow my child to also recognize that they have a choice in the behaviors that they do or what they do in any situation? So we're trying to have children through discipline have a cause and effect relationship and understanding. And these children are also going to learn that they have a voice and that they can communicate how they feel and that they are also loved by their parents. But a child who is beaten, a child who is hit, a child who is shouted, yelled at, that child is not always probably going to internalize that yelling, that licks is love. they may actually retreat from that parent, thinking that that parent, the person who is beating them, does not care about them, does not love them, does not understand what they're dealing with. And even though some parents or some of us may even say, I got licks, I was okay, we learn how to be manipulative. We learn how to just avoid the punishment. We learn how to hide. We learn not to express ourselves. And we learn certain behaviors that are maladaptive to functioning in society. So as a professional, we are trying to move away from this idea of physical punishment as a way of dealing with problematic behaviors, because what we're actually seeing is that these children are actually becoming more violent themselves, because this is how we deal with situations. This is how we deal with problems. And I also like to sometimes ask parents, if I'm even doing a workshop, how do we define a slap? What's a good slap versus a bad slap? What is too hard a slap? Is it when it stings, or when you see an imprint in the child's hand? How do we define a slap, a hit, a pinch? Because your pinch and my pinch could be two different things. So if we can't clearly define what a slap is and a pinch and a hit, or licks, because your licks would be a spot spoon, your licks is with a belt, then we should not be engaging in this type of behavior. I also want to go to the fact that Nadiya alluded to the fact that parents are overwhelmed. And one of the things that I've noticed, not only in clinical practice, but in doing my parenting workshops, physical punishment is not actually about the child in many cases. Have you ever really thought about a parent, I feared embarrassment? So when you go to the grocery store and your child is on the floor screaming and crying, you bust out 2 slaps, not because you're trying to train your child to behave in public, but because you don't want the other person to look at you and say, look at that child have no behavior. So because you cannot manage your own emotions and you're not taking pause to realize, okay, I feel embarrassed, I'm overwhelmed, maybe I need to take a second, you are going to then release this anger, release this frustration, or even release this fear onto your child. And what does that child now learn? That child learns that immediately I need to stop this behavior, but I haven't actually learned what I'm supposed to do instead. So we have not given the child a replacement behavior. Just don't do it. So I'm going to slap you, don't do it. And that is what we tend to do within the Caribbean context, within the Trinidadian context. So we're dealing with the fact that punishment is not necessarily for the betterment of the child, because we as adults are dealing with our own emotions that we're not able to manage. And then 2, we're not very clear on the difference between discipline and punishment. And when I educate parents based on that definition, they sometimes say, okay, I could understand that, but what are my alternatives? And the alternatives are available. They are programs where we're trying to teach parents about how to discipline your child differently, so that, as I had said in the beginning, they learn the cause and effect relationship. And I also don't want to speak for too long, because I know that we really want to hear from the audience, but I also want to just go to the fact that, as Melissa also alluded to, we are looking at the psychological implications of physical abuse or corporal punishment in terms of violence, depression, anxiety, poor relationships with others, poor relationship with themselves, not able to regulate emotions, not able to form proper attachments. If we're dealing with all of this, and we are not trying to or shouting from the rooftops that we need to make some sort of change with regards to how parents are treating with children, how even I treat with my own children, then are we ready to deal with a society that is essentially going to be traumatized? Do we have the capability? Do we have the facilities? Do we have the number of personnel to deal with what we are actually providing and producing in our society? And if we can't say yes to it, then we need to really change the narrative. And Timothy asked me, what is my title for my presentation? And very often I use this terminology wrongly, but I realize it really speaks to what I believe, which is spare the rod, and you can spare the child. We can give children an opportunity to develop social relationships, to develop a better relationship with their own emotions, if we arm them with the right tools to deal with themselves, by being a model, by being that parent who is able to provide alternative ways of disciplining your child. So in summary, I am one believer that definitely we need to do more education for parents. We need to understand that parents are overwhelmed, but we also need to give them the understanding that, are you punishing because you are overwhelmed, or are you punishing because you want your child to be better? And if you cannot define what a good slap is, then let's not do it at all. So really, we need to do better. We need to change the narrative to save our children, especially their futures. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonji. I just wanted to make sure, and I'll say it publicly, that no one stuck to their time, and I'm very happy no one did, because I think everyone had something to say. I think we could have had each one of you present on your own for a full hour, and I'm really grateful. But I really want to hear what the participants, I say participants, but the audience would like, what their views are. So if anyone has any questions, you can put your hand up or you can type it in the chat. Any questions, any comments? Some people may be typing. I see one hand has gone up. Rihanna McKenzie. You can just unmute your mic and ask.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Rihanna McKenzie. I'm from Newsday. So I did have a question. I believe the speaker was Nadiya Gower. You would have mentioned, being stressed, parents being stressed during COVID and not knowing how to discipline the children. So I was wondering, maybe Sonji Guppy could help with that one, just to expand a little bit on recommendations for parents on, alternatives, alternative discipline measures that they can use. I mean, children are back out to school now. So it's not the case now where, they're home all the time and they have as much stress with having to balance work life and dealing with their kids. But still, I think it's important for parents to understand, if we should ever be put in a situation to handle that balance without becoming, aggressive and having to discipline children in a way that may affect them negatively in the future. So yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Rihanna, for your question. If Timothy, if I can answer. One of the support services that parents can actually utilize would be Family Life Commission. They actually do have Common Sense Parenting. Common Sense Parenting is a parenting program that is available to different communities or within the actual congregation that they may attend. They can actually access this program. It is a 6-week program, if I can remember correctly, and it does teach them how to discipline their children differently, especially based on the approach in terms of understanding that cause and effect relationship, giving parents or arming parents with different discipline strategies and techniques to change the narrative between, from the punishment that we are accustomed to learning how to discipline their children differently. And it is a very good program. I am actually a Common Sense Parenting teacher and trainer. So I have actually taught the program, and you really do see parents have a change of heart when they recognize that they have the tools to treat their children differently. And one of the main things that I take away when I do a workshop or if I observe a workshop is that the relationship between the child and the parent becomes so much better. There is so much better communication because it's no longer one party afraid of the other. They have better relationships ongoing. So that is one avenue that parents can take. So parenting workshops are available. You just have to reach out to them. So one that I can at least recommend, or at least I can direct parents to, would be Family Life Commission, where they use the Common Sense Parenting.
Okay, thank you, Sonji. We have a question from a colleague, Dr. Peru. She asks, how can we educate parents on a wide scale? As indicated by one of the speakers, parents say that I get licks and I'm fine. And people still joke about licks. How can we make this cultural shift for parents to learn appropriate discipline methods? And before we, I don't know, Melissa, I don't know if you're in a position to speak about whether you see in your research a link to this, the cultural practice and the use, and whether you think there's anything that can be done to change that cultural perspective.
I think, like I said, because I wasn't specifically looking at this, I can't really speak with respect to my own research. But what I can say is, it isn't, a cultural practice isn't something that changes overnight. It's something that it's usually going to take, it's going to take a lot of time. Usually it will change with a generation. So it might well be that where we want to start is teaching some of this in schools. So start teaching it from primary school, teach it into secondary school. So we're educating within the school systems, but also that we have, and this is one of the things that was stated in one of the research papers, I don't remember which one it is now that I mentioned, that media is a good form of education as well. So educating society through media, through advertisements, through short videos, but educating definitely within the schools, but also within the media. And also potentially, although this one is a little bit tricky in Trinidad in particular, through faith-based services, through the church or the temple or that sort of things. I say that it can be a bit tricky because not everybody would necessarily be on board with what Sonji said in terms of spare the rod and spare the child. I love that, by the way, Sonji. But those are ways that we could potentially change the narrative, change the discourse.
Thank you, Melissa. And I did want to pull a piece of the question from Mr. Jeremie. Do you think that there's a role that law can play in adjusting cultural perspectives? So even if the culture, the society may not be on board with the ills of this practice, do you think that the law can step in or should step in to stop it in a public health perspective, what is good for society? As a former legislator and Attorney General.
Well, I mean, one of the main functions of legislation is to promote, in terms of policies which redound to the benefit of most people in the society. But there is legislative space, and then there are areas where the legislators ought to take their lead from social participants in the NGO sector and so on. I think that this may well be one of those.
Okay, thank you very much.
Reform should come from actors in the society, pushing legislators rather than the legislators taking it upon themselves.
Okay, thank you. Sonji, another question for you. Following up on, this is from the chat, following up on your response, do you know how the programs are being promoted? If people aren't at panels such as this one, people may not be privy to this information.
Many times, at least the Common Sense Parenting program that I know of right now, it was being promoted in schools, and it was being promoted at a time with United Way. So United Way was going to different schools throughout the country to actually promote this program. And also you can call the Family Life Commission and you can ask them about the program, and next they're actually doing another program. Because they tend to do it in clusters. So those would be two avenues. I will say that once there's enough interest, you can also, through the Family Life Commission, they have trainers that will go to your community. So they will go to the community and actually do the actual workshop, I believe, free of charge. So you do have access to. So that's one avenue I know as well, that you can get access to that particular program, which is the Common Sense program. And I also believe that there is another NGO called the Franciscan Institute. They were also very influential in getting the Common Sense program into Trinidad. So the Franciscan Institute is also another body that persons can reach out to, and you can call them. I can provide some information to Timothy so that he could also provide that information. But you can call them and ask them or let them know that you have an interest in this particular program, and they can arrange a trainer to come to a community, to a church, to a school to actually deliver the program. I believe that is at a cost, but I believe some schools do raise money so that they can have it. So they have sometimes the program ongoing from term to term based on the number of parents that want to attend. And what it really does within that program itself, it really does give parents different ways of dealing with their children in terms of different discipline practices.
Thank you, Sonji. I'm seeing two more questions and I'm aware of the time. So we have a comment from the Couva Children's Home and Crisis Nursery. And the comment is excellent presentation. The real issue lies in the propagation of the alternatives to corporal punishment, a point we've raised before. In other jurisdictions, structures were implemented to train teachers, parents, etc., in methods of alternate discipline. It can't be privately available to those who can afford to pay for it. Now, this just sparks in my mind a question I want to ask Nadiya. Nadiya, in respect of matters that may go before the courts, in cases where the court sees that there could be violence being meted out to children, is there any step or any program, any plan that the court adopts in how they deal with these cases?
Well, under the children's courts, I mean, generally they want to seek the rehabilitation of children and want to move away from putting them in homes, you know. But as I mentioned before, in terms of the report that was commissioned in mid-July of last year, I mean, that arose out of two boys who were put into a center after their mother was having difficulty managing them. So, I mean, I do believe that there are rehabilitative programs that are supposed to be established under the children's courts because they want to move away from further punishing children who are already coming out of a violent arrangement or a violent situation.
Okay, thank you. Another question we have is part of the problem that people are becoming parents without being ready to be parents. In other words, should we have great emphasis on family planning alongside parental education? This is clearly a Sonji question.
How is that clearly a Sonji? Okay, I would say yes. One of the things that I found was so worthwhile was doing parenting workshops in the actual, this would have been in Grenada where I did this. Well, we did parenting workshops when mothers actually went to their prenatal clinic visits. So we used to talk about parenting practices. We used to talk about the stress of being a parent, the stress of becoming a new mother. So we used to give that space to parents before they even became parents. And I thought that was so impactful. And that's something that I've sometimes made suggestions in terms of in the clinic. Why don't we have days when people are there? We just have parents sit down and we have trained trainers just talking about different ways to treat their child, but also how do you stay calm? How do you deal with your own stress levels? How do you deal with your own feelings of anxiety, sadness, stress? I think that's going to be such an influential thing that we can do because there's no book to tell you how to parent. So even though I'm saying, we're going to workshops, there's no actual manual that says do this at this time. So every parent at some point in time is going to feel so overwhelmed. But that is something that I think can be so worthwhile. If you know you're going to have a baby, sign up for a parenting workshop if they're available, or even just sit in one or do the research, read about it. Now, I'm talking from an approach where persons may be literate, but those who may not be literate, which is sometimes the case, or the smaller communities or the impoverished communities, we as a community, so if we're having this panel, we all should walk away with something or armed with some sort of information or a drive to go to our communities and say, you know what, let's talk about this, let's do this. Let's arm our people with the knowledge and understanding that one, you need the support and we can provide the support. And two, you can utilize these strategies when you feel, or if you're under stress. I think that's one of the things that we need to do. Take our information and run with it and disperse it as much as we can.
Thank you, Sonji. Last question, and I have to allow it because it's a student's question. Melissa, I think it's a question for you. Recently, several cases, now Melissa does live in Wales, so I hope she's aware of what's been happening in our social media. Recently, several cases of school violence have been highlighted on our local media. Whenever these videos pop up, persons always blame the level of violence on corporal punishment being banned. How do you view these comments, and do you think there's any link between violence and corporal punishment? I think you touched on the last part, but the first part is interesting. that people actually say that there's this link to the banning of corporal punishment and why we are such a violent society.
Yeah, I think it's obvious why they are making that link, because a lot of these videos that we've seen it's young people in school uniform. So it's happening, either on school premises or outside of schools, but we're talking about school children fighting in school uniform. That's what I imagine that the person that's talking about. And because within schools, teachers can no longer hit children, corporal punishment is banned, that's where that narrative comes from. But it doesn't mean that all punishment is banned in schools. And quite frankly, the research suggests that other types of punishment, or other forms of punishment, are a lot more useful than corporal punishment in these cases. So perhaps what we should be thinking about is, what other types of punishment can we be doing within schools when we see this type of thing happening? But I suppose, and this is something Sonji could potentially weigh in on, what is causing what we're seeing? Why are these young people, why are they fighting 2 days after schools are back out, after being cooped up for 2 years because of COVID, and they're now all back together again in society? They're the things that we can think about why this is happening, and it doesn't have anything to do with stopped in schools and that's why this is happening. So a lot more to do with a lot of the other things that are happening in society, and perhaps that's where the narrative should be going.
Thank you, Melissa. So we were supposed to wrap up at 6 o'clock, but I do want to give every speaker at least a last thought, before we wrap up. So we want to start with Mr. Jeremie. Final thought.
So I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Afonso, for putting on this seminar this evening. It's an important area, and the faculty has a role to play in shaping consensus in this area. So that's where I would like my comment to go towards.
Thank you, Jeremie. Miss Melissa?
Yeah, I'm really grateful that you asked me to be a part of the panel. I think it's been brilliant. Ask me again, I'll come again. And Sonji, I'd love to do some research with you in the future, if at all possible. I think you're doing some really good stuff, and I'd like to do some of that good work with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Nadiya?
Yes, I want to thank you for inviting me to the panel. My takeaway is really to do with the legislatures in terms of the definition of reasonable punishment. I mean, that is vague. And I just want to flow from what Sonji said. If we can't differentiate between my pinch and your pinch, then we shouldn't be having that discussion at all. So the question of reasonable punishment should be taken out entirely. And I hope that we can explore other means of disciplining our children.
Thank you, Nadiya. And Sonji?
Thank you so much for having me as part of the panel. It was really an enjoyable experience. So yes, like Melissa, invite me again. And Melissa, yes, I will work with you. I think the last thing I really just want to say, which is probably going to be my slogan, which would be spare the rod, spare the child. And also, I think that one of the things we need to remember when we are part of these discussions or listening or we're trying to understand the situation, we need to make sure that we take the information that we have gained and we really try to utilize it. We try to mobilize and we try to act. I think too often, I'm going to be very long-winded with this, too often we sit on these panels and we don't do anything. We just listen, we nod, and then we move away from it and we forget about it. But we need to actually act in ways that can benefit the community as much as possible so that change can happen and we could be the change. So thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this discussion.
Thank you, Sonji, and thank you to all the panelists. I have to say that it could not be done without you. No one told me no. No one even had to hesitate. And Melissa's actually up at 11 o'clock in Wales. And she did tell me the most difficult thing would be I have to stay up late. But I am grateful to everyone who attended the event and stayed. I've been watching the participants list. We've been at 58 for the entire hour. So that's a really good thing. So thank you very much. Thank you to Mrs. Anita Ali Kunkunali for actually assisting in the setting up of the event, and to Dr. Perot and Dr. Koo for sharing our flyer. So you all, normally I would say get home safely, but I think everyone is already at home. So thank you for joining us, and we may very well have another presentation or another panel discussion on another topical issue. Thank you very much and be safe.